The night Daniel Boone rode into Redemption Creek, he had $40 in his saddlebag, a reputation that preceded him like smoke before fire, and absolutely no intention of staying longer than sunrise. The town of Redemption Creek sat in the eastern flank of the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1878, a place where the wind came down off the mountains with a personality of its own, and the saloon stayed lit until well past midnight. It was a town that had seen its share of drifters, outlaws, cattle drivers, and broken men, but it had also seen its share of survivors, people who had chosen the hard land and refused to let it break them. Daniel Boone was the kind of man who belonged to both categories simultaneously, and he wore that contradiction as naturally as he wore the battered leather duster that hung from his broad shoulders. He was 28 years old, dark-haired, with eyes the deep brown of creek water in shadow, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from one of the granite ridges visible from the edge of town. He had been a Pinkerton agent for 3 years before a disagreement over methods had sent him drifting westward, picking up work where he could find it. Escort jobs, mostly. Riding guard on payroll wagons, watching over witnesses, accompanying businessmen through dangerous territory. He was good at it. He was patient, sharp-eyed, and he had the particular gift of being able to read a room before he had fully walked into it. The man who had hired him was Orville Stanton, a land broker of middling reputation who operated out of Cheyenne and traveled through the territory regularly. Stanton had wired ahead to Daniel's last known location in Laramie, offering $50 for one night's work. "Guard my associate's daughter," the wire had said. "She is staying at the Redemption Creek Hotel and has received threats. One night, nothing more." $50 was more than Daniel usually earned in a week of honest work, and he was not in a position to refuse it. He tied his horse at the post outside the hotel, a 2-story building with a painted sign and a porch lamp that cast a warm amber glow over the weathered boards. The clerk at the desk was a thin young man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who looked at Daniel's duster and the holster at his hip and swallowed visibly before producing a key. "Miss Bailey is expecting you," the clerk said. "Room 7, top of the stairs, turn right." Daniel took the key, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the door with 3 even knuckles. There was a pause, long enough that he noticed it. Then a voice came from the other side of the door, clear and steady, though he could detect in it the slight elevation that meant she was working to keep it that way. "Who is it?" "Daniel Boone," he said. "Orville Stanton hired me." Another pause, the sound of something being set down on a hard surface, then the click of a latch being drawn back and the door opened. Clara Bailey stood in the doorway and looked up at him, and Daniel Boone, who had spent the better part of a decade becoming very good at not being affected by things, felt the whole composition of his evening rearrange itself without asking his permission. She was 24 years old, with hair the color of dark honey pinned up in a practical style that had partially escaped its pins, giving her a slightly undone quality that was entirely at odds with the careful alertness in her green eyes. She was wearing a plain brown dress with a white collar, the kind of dress that suggested she valued practicality over fashion, and she was holding a small oil lamp in one hand. On the table behind her, he could see a journal open to a page covered in neat handwriting, and beside it, a revolver, compact and well-maintained. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are assessing, not afraid precisely, but measuring. "You are Daniel Boone," she said, "not a question. I am. The man who used to work for Pinkerton." He felt a small, familiar tension at that. "Word travels." "I made inquiries," she said simply. "Mr. Stanton told me he was sending someone. I wanted to know who." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He stepped inside and she closed the door behind him. The room was small and tidy. The bed was made with military precision. The single window faced the main street of Redemption Creek, and the curtain was drawn halfway, allowing her to see out while making it difficult to see in. He noticed all of this before he had taken 2 steps. "You moved the lamp away from the window," he said. Yes, she said, so my silhouette would not be visible from outside. He looked at her more carefully then. You have done this before. She set the oil lamp down on the table beside the journal and turned to face him. I have been cautious before. There is a difference. She gestured to the wooden chair against the wall. Sit, if you like. I am told you are supposed to stay through the night. I see no reason we need to stand on ceremony about it. He sat. She sat at the table, not exactly turning her back to him, but angling herself toward the journal in a way that made clear she intended to continue working. What is the threat? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, considering how much to tell him. He recognized the calculation and waited. My father was Gareth Bailey, she said. He was a surveyor. He mapped a significant portion of land in the northern part of this territory. He died 4 months ago. She paused. He left me his survey journals and his legal claim to a parcel of land northeast of here. It is good land. There is water on it, and the elevation makes it suitable for both grazing and farming. And someone wants it, Daniel said. A man named Wade Prout wants it, she said. He has wanted it for 2 years. My father refused to sell. Wade Prout is the sort of man who takes what he wants when refusing to sell becomes inconvenient. Is he in town? I do not know where he is, she said, and for the first time he heard something beneath the composure, something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. That is the difficulty. His men are. 3 of them have been seen in Redemption Creek in the last 2 days. Daniel leaned back in the chair and crossed one boot over his knee. What are you doing in Redemption Creek? If Prout's men are here, she met his eyes steadily. I am here to meet with a land attorney in the morning. His name is Charles Vance and he operates out of this town. I need him to file documentation that formally registers my claim before Prout can contest it legally. She folded her hands together on the journal. 1 night. Then this is resolved, one way or another. 1 night, Daniel repeated. That is what you were hired for, she said, and there was a quality in her voice that was not dismissive but was perhaps self-contained, the voice of a woman who had learned to expect that most things in her life would be temporary. He did not argue the point. He settled into the chair and began the work of watching the night. The first 2 hours passed quietly. Clara Bailey wrote in her journal with focused concentration, occasionally consulting a set of papers that she drew from a leather satchel. She made no effort at conversation, but neither did she ignore him entirely. Every so often she would glance up to check the window, and every time she did she found him already watching it, which seemed to satisfy her in some fundamental way because her shoulders would ease slightly before she turned back to her work. Around 10 o'clock she set down her pen and stretched her fingers, pressing her palms together and spreading them in a gesture that was entirely unself-conscious. Have you eaten? She asked. Before I came. I have bread and some dried apple from the general store, she said. You are welcome to it. It was a small thing, an ordinary thing, but there was something in the way she offered it without performance, without the particular careful sweetness that people sometimes used when they were nervous around armed men, that made him look at her differently. Thank you, he said. She brought the bread and they ate in a comfortable silence that had no business being comfortable given they had known each other for less than 2 hours. The wind moved outside. A horse somewhere in the street stamped and blew. The oil lamp threw its amber circle across the table. You kept your father's survey journals, Daniel said after a while. She looked up. Yes, not just the legal documents. No, she glanced down at the journal in front of her, the one she had been writing in. He taught me to survey. I went with him on his last 3 major expeditions. I know this land as well as he did, possibly better in some sections. She said it plainly without pride or apology. The journal I am working in is my own. I have been recording observations about the northeastern parcel, water sources, soil composition, timber stands, things an attorney will need. You intend to work the land yourself, he said. I intend to build something on it, she said. A proper homestead, not a claim someone runs for 2 seasons and abandons, something that lasts. He looked at her and said nothing, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. It had been professional before. Now it was also something else, something curious, in the way a man is curious about a fire when he has spent a long time in the cold. At 11:30 he heard it. Below the window, in the narrow lane that ran beside the hotel, the soft sound of boots on packed earth, slow and deliberate, the kind of walking that was trying not to be heard. He was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. He crossed the room in 3 quiet steps and positioned himself at the edge of the window frame, looking down and to the left. In the shadows below, he counted 2 figures moving along the wall of the building. He turned to Clara. She was already standing, having read the change in him, and she had the small revolver in her hand. "Stay back from the window," he said very quietly. "Away from the door, toward the far corner." "How many?" she said just as quietly. "2 that I can see." Possibly more at the front, he thought quickly. Is there a back staircase in this hotel? I noticed one, at the end of the hall past room 9. He looked at her. In the lamplight, her face was calm in the way that meant she was working very hard to be calm, and he felt a sudden fierce, irrational protectiveness that went entirely beyond the scope of the $50 he had been promised. "We are going to move," he said, quietly. "Leave the lamp. Take what matters from the satchel." She was already moving. She pulled the most important papers from the satchel, folded them inside the journal, and wrapped them in a length of cloth with efficient, practiced hands. She tucked the bundle under her arm, held the revolver at her side, and looked at him with eyes that were bright and steady. "Ready," she said. He opened the door a crack and listened. The hotel hallway was quiet. The sounds from below had stopped, which meant the 2 men had either entered the building or repositioned themselves, neither option being comfortable. He led her into the hall, keeping himself between her and the main staircase, moving quickly to the back stairs. The stairs were narrow and creaked twice, but there was no way around it. They emerged into the rear yard of the hotel, which was dark and smelled of horses and old hay. He took her hand without thinking about it, pulling her to the right, along the back of the building toward the livery stable that sat at the far end of the block. His hand was large around hers, and she gripped back without hesitation. They made the livery without incident. Inside, the horses stirred and blew softly in the darkness. He found his own horse by feel in the 3rd stall and led the animal out quickly. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," she said without qualification. "We need to put distance between ourselves and this hotel until morning. The attorney's office opens at 8. We come back at 8. And the men Prout sent. By morning they will know you are not where they expected. That changes things in our favor. People who are looking for someone expect them to be hiding. We will not be hiding." She considered this for exactly 3 seconds. "All right," she said. He helped her onto the horse and swung up behind her, and they rode out of Redemption Creek into the dark Wyoming night. He did not know, in that moment, that he had just made the most consequential decision of his life. They rode north for about 1.5 miles, following a creek bed that gave them cover and soft ground that muffled the horse's hooves, until Daniel found what he was looking for: a shallow overhang of rock above the creek bank, sheltered from the wind and invisible from the trail. He had scouted the terrain around Redemption Creek when he had ridden in, out of habit, because knowing the land around a place had saved his life more than once. He helped Clara down from the horse and tied the animal to a scrub pine at the edge of the overhang. The night was cold, the Wyoming autumn having teeth in it even before the real cold came, and the sky above them was absolutely crowded with stars. Clara sat on a flat rock at the edge of the overhang and looked up at the sky. After a moment she said, "In my father's survey work, the stars were our primary navigation tool at night. I know every major constellation visible in the northern hemisphere." "So do I," Daniel said, settling himself at the entrance to the overhang where he could watch the trail. "My grandfather taught me. He was a hunter." She looked at him. "Your grandfather who gave you your name?" He turned slightly. "Pardon?" "Daniel Boone," she said, and there was a hint of something in her voice that was almost, but not quite, amusement. "The famous frontiersman." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood. My father had a sense of humor or an ambition. I was never entirely sure which. She did smile at that, small and real, and it was the first time he had seen her smile, and he felt it land somewhere in his chest like a warm stone. "Did you know him?" she asked. "Your grandfather?" "Some. He died when I was 12. He taught me to track, to read weather, to build a fire without smoke, the useful things." He paused. "Your father, what did he teach you?" She was quiet for a moment, and he understood that the question had gone somewhere tender. "He taught me to measure things precisely," she said. "He said that most problems in this world come from imprecision, from people not looking carefully enough at what is actually in front of them." She turned the journal in her hands. "He used to say that a map is only as good as the honesty of the person who made it. That you have to be willing to put down what is actually there, not what you want to be there." Daniel thought about that. "He sounds like a careful man." "He was," she said, "and a good one." She looked up at the stars again. "He died of a fever. He was 61 years old, and he died of a fever in a hotel room in Casper, and Wade Prout was at his funeral with his hat in his hand looking sorry about it. And 3 days later Prout sent a man to my boarding house in Laramie with an offer to buy the land." Daniel watched her profile. "What did you do?" "I told the man to get out of my room," she said calmly. "And then I went to the land office and began the process of filing the proper documentation myself." She looked at him. "Which is why I am in Redemption Creek, which is why you are here." He held her gaze for a moment. "For one night," he said. "For one night," she agreed. But the night was not done with them yet. They talked through the small hours, in the way that people talk when the dark and the cold and the distance from the ordinary world creates a kind of permission for honesty. She told him about her childhood following her father through the territory, learning to read topographical signs and weather patterns before she could properly read a novel. He told her, haltingly at first and then with more ease, about his years with Pinkerton, the work he had believed in initially, and the gradual wearing down of that belief when he had seen the agency used as a private army against workers who were only trying to survive. "I walked away from it," he said. "I could have made a case, filed reports, tried to work within it, but I looked at the men I would have been reporting to and understood that nothing would change, so I walked away." "Do you regret it?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Not the walking away. Sometimes I regret not having a place to walk toward." She looked at him steadily. "I think you have to build the place," she said. "I do not think it exists in advance. You build it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved in his expression that he could not entirely contain, something raw and not entirely safe. He looked back at the trail. She did not press it. She leaned her head back against the rock and closed her eyes. "You should sleep," he said. "I will watch." "I will not be able to sleep," she said. "Try." She surprised him then. Within 20 minutes her breathing had evened out and she was asleep sitting against the rock, the journal still in her arms, her dark honey hair loose now from the pins and falling across her shoulder. He watched the trail and watched the stars move and did not sleep at all. At 6 in the morning, with the sky beginning to lighten in the east, he woke her gently with a hand on her shoulder. She came awake cleanly, no disorientation, just open eyes and a quick taking in of where she was. She looked at him and he saw the exact moment she remembered everything. "We should go back," he said. "The attorney opens at 8. I want to arrive when there are people on the street." She stood and smoothed her dress and repinned her hair with the pins she had kept somehow in her pocket, and then she looked at him and said, "You stayed the whole night." "That was the job," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." He helped her onto the horse again, and they rode back toward Redemption Creek in the gold and pink light of early morning. The town was waking when they arrived. Smoke rising from chimneys, the smell of coffee and bread, a woman sweeping a porch, 2 men talking outside the blacksmith's shop. Daniel kept them to the main street, visible and ordinary, walking the horse at a calm pace. He saw no sign of the 2 men from the previous night, but he did not relax his vigilance for a moment. Charles Vance's law office was a narrow building between the general store and the barber. Its sign was modest, painted in dark green letters. Vance himself answered the door when Daniel knocked at 8:05. A short, broad man of about 50, with a very precise gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read situations quickly. "Miss Bailey," he said, "I had expected you last night to drop off the initial documents." "There was a complication," she said. "I have them here." Inside the office, over a pot of coffee that Vance produced from a small iron stove, Clara laid out the papers she had carried through the night, the survey documentation, the deed transfer from her father's estate, and her own surveying notes that she had been compiling in the journal. Vance reviewed them with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 30 years not making mistakes, occasionally making a small sound of approval. Daniel sat in the chair by the door and watched the window. When Vance was finished reviewing, he looked up at Clara over his spectacles. "This is complete and in order," he said. "I can file with the Territorial Land Office today. Once filed, any contestation from Wade Prout will have to go through proper legal channels, which will take considerably longer than he would prefer, and will require him to demonstrate a superior legal claim which he does not have." Clara let out a slow breath. The relief was visible in her shoulders, the way a drawn bow releases. "How long?" she asked. "The filing today, acknowledgment from Cheyenne within 4 to 6 weeks, Vance said. "You should remain accessible during that period." "Is there an address where you can receive correspondence?" "I will be at the land itself," she said. "I intend to establish residence within the month." Vance looked at her over his spectacles again. "That is very direct, Miss Bailey." "Yes," she said simply, "it is." Daniel escorted her out of the lawyer's office and they stood on the boardwalk in the morning sun. The job was done. The night was over. There was nothing, technically, keeping him in Redemption Creek. He stood next to her and looked out at the street and thought about the $40 in his saddlebag, and the 50 he would collect from Stanton and the open territory ahead of him, and none of it had any pull at all. "What will you do now?" he asked. She turned and looked at him. "I am going to ride out to the land today. I want to assess what is there before winter comes. I have a tent and basic supplies. I will begin planning where to build." "Alone," he said. "I have managed alone before," she said, and it was not a rebuke, it was simply a fact. He looked at her in the morning light. Her green eyes were clear and direct, and she was not asking him for anything, which was, he thought, precisely the problem. He would have known how to respond to a request. The absence of one left him entirely responsible for his own next decision. "I was hired for one night," he said. "You were," she agreed. He nodded slowly. "Then I suppose anything past this point is my own business." Something moved across her face. Not quite hope, not quite surprise, something more careful than either. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that I have no particular place to be," he said. "And that the territory northeast of here is rough country and winter is coming faster than usual this year. You can read it in the high clouds. And that a woman who surveys land alone in autumn in Wyoming is the sort of woman who might find it useful to have an extra pair of eyes." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, very carefully, "I am not in a position to pay what you would normally earn." "I am not proposing employment," he said. The silence that followed was the most significant silence of Daniel Boone's life up to that point. "All right," she said, finally. "Then let us go and see the land." They collected supplies from the general store, including flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, and 2 heavy wool blankets in addition to what Clara had already packed. Daniel bought a box of ammunition for his rifle and a second water canteen. Clara bought a new surveying notebook and 2 sticks of graphite. They rode northeast out of Redemption Creek as the morning warmed, and the sky opened up into the particular blue of Wyoming autumn, a blue so deep and absolute that it seemed to push down on the land with a physical weight. The trail climbed gradually, moving from the grassland into more mixed terrain, stands of cottonwood along the creek bottoms giving way to pine and aspen on the higher slopes. Clara rode her own horse, a compact and sensible bay mare she called Margaret, and she rode well, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent a significant portion of her life in the saddle. She pointed out landmarks as they rode, not to impress him, but because she was genuinely observant and it was her natural way of moving through the world. "See that ridge to the northeast," she said. "That is the eastern boundary. The creek comes down through there. It runs year-round, my father's notes indicated, and I have seen it myself once." "Good," Daniel said. "Year-round water is everything up here." "Yes," she said. "That is what makes this land worth fighting over." They rode in a comfortable silence for a while, and then she said, without looking at him, "Tell me more about your grandfather." He was surprised by the question. He thought about it honestly. "He was a Cherokee man," he said. "My grandmother was white, the daughter of a trader. Their marriage was not popular with either side of the family. They built their life in a space between two worlds, and they made it work through sheer determination and a deep, obvious love for each other that was embarrassing to observe as a child, and that I understood much better later." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a complicated heritage to carry." "All heritage is complicated," he said. "You learn to carry what is good in it, and to understand what was unjust about the world that shaped it." She looked at him then sideways with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but something more balanced than either. "You speak about injustice plainly," she said. "I have benefited from certain things and suffered because of others," he said. "It makes a person inclined toward precision, as your father might say." She smiled at that. A real smile, unhurried. They reached the northeastern parcel in the early afternoon. It was as she had described. Good land, better than good, sitting in the valley between two long ridges with the creek running clean and cold along its western edge. The grass was thick and golden in the autumn light. The timber on the ridge above was heavy and straight, the kind of pine that would build solid walls. The soil along the creek bank was dark and rich. Daniel dismounted and crouched to look at the land, turning a handful of soil in his fingers. "Good drainage," he said. "Not too sandy, not heavy clay. You could grow a kitchen garden here in spring." "Yes," Clara said, standing beside him. "And over there, that flat section with the natural windbreak from the ridge, that is where the house should go." My father agreed. He noted it in his journals. She said it matter-of-factly, but he heard the grief in it, the way she folded her father into the present tense of the land, as though he were still there in some useful form. They set up camp that afternoon, pitching the tent in the sheltered area she had identified and building a fire in a shallow depression that would hold the heat and block the wind. Daniel cut pine boughs for additional shelter, and Clara unpacked the supplies with systematic efficiency. Over supper, a simple meal of salt pork and beans and coffee that tasted extraordinary in the cold air, she showed him her surveying notes. He looked at her sketches and measurements with genuine attention. "You are very good at this," he said. "I know," she said without false modesty. "My father was better, but I am very good." "What would you do with the house," he asked, "if you build it?" She looked at the fire for a moment, and the firelight caught in her green eyes and turned them gold. "Large enough for a proper kitchen," she said. "Because a proper kitchen is what makes a house a home, I think. A good stove, windows that face east for the morning light, a porch on the south side for the afternoons." She paused. "And a study, a room with shelves for the journals and the equipment." "A study," he said. "I am a surveyor," she said. "That is my work. I intend to continue it." He looked at her across the fire. "You intend to survey and build and keep the land all at once," he said. "Most things worth having require doing several things at once," she said. He thought about this. He thought about it for a long time. The days that followed were unlike anything Daniel Boone had experienced in his adult life, which had been primarily composed of movement, watchfulness, and the careful avoidance of anything that required him to stay in one place. He stayed. He did not precisely decide to stay. It simply became impossible to imagine leaving. The way a particular note of music can become impossible to imagine the room without once it has been played. They worked well together in the way that people work well together when their particular strengths are complementary rather than identical. Clara measured and recorded and planned with meticulous care. Daniel built and repaired and watched the surrounding terrain and kept the camp functional. In the mornings, she would take her instruments and walk the boundaries of the land, making notes and sketches, and he would ride the perimeter to check that there had been no sign of Prute's men. In the evenings, they cooked together and talked, and the talking was good in the way that real conversation is good, with the back and forth of people who are genuinely interested in how the other person's mind works. He told her about the Kansas cattle drives he had worked early in his career, the particular complicated society of the trail, the way the drovers had their own code of conduct and honor that had nothing to do with anything written in a statute book. She told him about a surveying expedition she and her father had undertaken 2 years before his death, into the high plateau country north of the Wind River Range, where the land was so austere and vast that it made a person feel simultaneously very small and very clear. One evening, about a week into their time on the land, she was sketching the planned layout of the house site, and she said, casually, without looking up, "Do you know how to lay a foundation?" "I do," he said. "Stone foundation is better here than wood, more stable and warmer in winter." She looked up at that. "You have built before." "A cabin in Colorado a few years ago. I lived in it for a winter." He paused. "I sold it when I moved on, which I have always thought was a mistake." She held his gaze. "Why did you sell it?" "Because I had not yet understood what I was building it for," he said. The fire popped between them. The night was very quiet and very cold and very full of stars. She looked back down at her sketch, but he could see from the angle of her jaw that she was thinking carefully about what he had said. 9 days after they arrived at the land, 3 riders came over the eastern ridge. Daniel saw them before Clara did, from his position at the edge of camp where he had been splitting wood. He set down the axe with deliberate quiet and moved toward the fire where Clara was working. "3 riders coming from the east," he said, low and even. "Stay at the fire. Keep doing what you are doing. Let me stand." She looked at him once and then looked back at her work. Her hand was steady on the page. The riders came down from the ridge at an unhurried pace that was itself a kind of statement, the deliberate slowness of men who have decided they are not afraid of what they are approaching. They were dressed in trail clothes, working men, but there was a hardness in the way they sat their horses that went beyond ordinary ranch work. The man in front was older, with a gray-streaked beard and flat, pale eyes. He looked at Daniel first, then at Clara. "Miss Bailey," he said. "Yes," she said, looking up from her work with a neutrality that was remarkable. "Wade Prute sends his regards," the man said. "He wanted you to know he is still interested in this property and that his previous offer stands." "His previous offer was declined," she said. "He knows that. He was hoping you might reconsider." "I have not," she said. "I have filed legal documentation with Charles Vance of Redemption Creek, which has been forwarded to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. My claim to this land is in the process of formal registration. If Mr. Prute has a legal objection, he is welcome to pursue it through proper channels." The man with the pale eyes shifted his gaze to Daniel. "And who is this?" "My associate," Clara said. The man looked at Daniel for a long moment. Daniel looked back. He was standing easily, not drawing, but the posture of his body was entirely clear about what would happen if it became necessary. "Mr. Prute is a patient man," the rider said, "but patience has limits." "So does my interest in this conversation," Daniel said. "You have delivered your message. You are welcome to ride back the way you came." The pale-eyed man studied him for another moment. Then he turned his horse without another word, and the 3 riders went back up the eastern ridge the way they had come. Clara watched them go. Then she set down her pen and pressed both hands flat on the journal page for a moment, the only sign of what it had cost her to sit that still. "He will not stop," she said. "No," Daniel agreed, "but you have filed. Every week that passes makes his position weaker legally. He knows that." "Then why does he keep sending men?" "Because he is betting you will scare," he said, "that you will decide the land is not worth the trouble." She looked at him. "It is worth the trouble," she said. "I know it is," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Thank you," she said, "for not flinching." "That is what I am here for," he said. Yes, she said softly. But it is also who you are. He did not know what to do with that. He picked up the axe and went back to the wood, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. The first real cold came in the third week of October, settling over the territory with the serious intent of a season that had made up its mind. The nights dropped well below freezing, and the morning grass was heavy with frost that did not lift until nearly midday. The creek ran clear and cold and fast, which was good because a slow creek would ice up. The sky turned the particular shade of pewter that Daniel associated with impending snow. "We need more shelter," he said one morning, looking at the tent. "I know," she said. "I can build a temporary structure," he said. "Nothing elaborate, but something solid enough to keep out the wind and hold heat." "I have been thinking about where exactly the permanent house should stand," she said. "If we build the temporary structure in roughly the right place, we can use it as a foundation reference point." He looked at her. "You want to use the temporary shelter as a building landmark." "It seems practical," she said. He almost smiled. It was a very Clara Bailey solution, sensible and forward-looking, and using the present to serve the future. "Show me where," he said. She showed him. He spent 3 days felling timber from the ridge and hauling it down with the horses, cutting and notching and fitting, while she continued her work and occasionally held a beam steady with her own hands when a second pair of hands was needed. She did not make a show of it. She simply appeared and helped with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she applied to everything. On the second day of building, she appeared at his elbow while he was measuring a beam and said, "You cut the notches the same way my father did." "Exactly the same angle." He looked up. "Your father built. He built our first house," she said. "In Nebraska when I was 6, I used to sit on the logs and watch him." She ran her hand along the beam he had notched. He hummed when he worked. Old songs mostly, things his mother had sung to him. "Do you remember them?" he asked. "Some," she said. And then quietly she sang a few bars of something he did not recognize, a slow, gentle melody in a minor key that sounded like it had come from a long way back in time. Her voice was not trained, but it was true, and it fell into the cold morning air with a kind of weight that made the air feel different. He went very still. She stopped and looked at him. "Sorry," she said. "I do not know why I did that." "Do not be sorry," he said. "Please." She looked at him for a moment with that careful assessment he was beginning to know very well. Then she went back to the fire. He stood looking at the beam he had been measuring for a full minute before he trusted himself to go back to work. The shelter was finished in 3 days. A single rectangular room of notched pine logs with a sod roof that would hold the heat, and a small stone fireplace that Daniel built in the corner with flat creek stones. It was rough but solid, and when he lit the first fire in the fireplace and they stood in the small space watching the smoke rise through the simple chimney, the shelter felt, for just a moment, like something that had always been there. Clara looked around the small room. "It is very good," she said. "It is functional," he said. "The permanent house will be better." She looked at him. "You keep saying that." "Saying what?" "The permanent house, as though you are already planning it." He looked at her directly. "I am," he said. She held his gaze. The fire was warm at their backs, and outside the wind was picking up, and there was a particular quality to the light through the single small window he had cut in the east-facing wall, the pale gold of a late October afternoon. "Daniel," she said. "Yes." "I need to be clear with you about something," she said, and her voice was careful in the way of a person who has thought hard about what they are about to say. "I do not think you came out here with me simply because you had nowhere else to be." "No," he agreed, "I did not. And I do not think I asked you to stay simply because the territory is rough." "No," he said again. "I did not think so." She looked at the fire and then back at him. "I have not been very good at needing people," she said. "My father died, and before that my mother died, and I have learned to be self-sufficient in a way that is sometimes useful and sometimes, I think, a wall that I have not been entirely honest about." He listened to her without moving. "And I think," she continued, "that I have been building that wall even here with you, when what I have actually wanted to do for approximately the last 10 days is to stop being so very sensible about everything. He crossed the small room in 2 steps and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him with those green eyes that were entirely clear, entirely present, no walls anywhere that he could see. "Clara," he said. Her name in his voice was a whole different thing from anything that had been said in that small room before. "Yes," she said. He reached up and put his hand against the side of her face, very carefully, the way you hold something that matters. She turned her cheek slightly into his hand and closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them again, she was looking at him with an expression so direct and unguarded that it made something ache in the center of his chest. He kissed her. Softly at first, the way a question is asked before an answer is expected, and then when she kissed him back, with her hand coming up to grip the front of his coat, with more. The fire was warm and the wind was rising outside, and somewhere above them, the pewter sky was deciding something. When they finally broke apart, she pressed her forehead against his chin and he put both arms around her, and they stood in the firelight for a long time, not speaking, just breathing in the same warm space. "You should know," he said into her hair, "that I am not planning to leave." "I know," she said. "I mean that clearly," he said. "Not as a vague intention. I mean that this is where I intend to be." She leaned back slightly to look at him. "You are certain?" "I have been certain for longer than it would be decent to admit," he said. She almost laughed. He felt it in the small movement of her shoulders. "How long?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "When you told the pale-eyed man that his previous offer had been declined," he said, with exactly that tone. "I was entirely lost at that point." She did laugh then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and it rang in the small log room and went right through him. The snow came on the 1st of November. It came in the night, quietly, the way serious things often arrive, and when they woke in the morning the world had been completely and fundamentally remade. The land outside the shelter was white and still and absolute. The ridges that had been brown and gold the day before now entirely white. The creek invisible beneath a fringe of white-loaded brush. The sky was the flat, even white of a storm that was not finished. Daniel stood in the doorway of the shelter and looked at it. Behind him, Clara was building up the fire. "How much?" she asked. 2 feet on the flat, more in the drifts. "Can we get to the creek for water?" "Yes, if we are careful. The trail I packed is mostly clear." She appeared at his elbow with 2 mugs of coffee, and they stood together in the doorway watching the snow continue to fall in long, slow, serious curtains. "We are staying for a while," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." She handed him his coffee and leaned her shoulder against his arm, and he thought, This is the thing I have been moving toward for 8 years without knowing its shape." They were snowed in for 4 days, which turned out to be neither a hardship nor a danger because Daniel had built the shelter well and stocked enough wood, and they had sufficient supplies. They spent the time in the particular intimacy of people who are temporarily reduced to each other's sole company and find it entirely sufficient. She read to him in the evenings from the survey journals her father had kept, and the journals were extraordinary documents, precise and scientific, but also full of her father's personality, his observations about wildlife and weather, and the character of particular landscapes that went beyond measurements into something closer to love. He listened to her read and watched the fire and felt something settle in him like water settling after a disturbance, a fundamental quiet that he had not known he was missing until it arrived. On the second snowed-in evening, he told her something he had not told another person. He told her about the night in Missouri in 1875, when a Pinkerton operation he had been part of had gone wrong in a way that still sat heavy in his chest. Not a violent wrong, but a moral one, where men who had been on strike for fair wages had been beaten by agents, and he had been unable to prevent it, and had filed a report about it, and the report had been quietly buried. He told her this without softening it. She listened. She did not offer easy comfort. When he was finished, she said, "That is the weight you carry, the thing you did not do." "Yes," he said. "You could not have stopped it alone," she said. You were one man against the direction of an institution. I know that, he said. I know it logically. It does not make the weight less. No, she said, but you walked away from the institution. You refused to keep being part of it. That matters. She looked at him steadily. What you do now matters. The person you are choosing to be here now, that is the answer to that weight, Daniel. Not getting rid of it, outweighing it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his without any hesitation at all. On the third evening it stopped snowing. They went outside and walked in the snow in the late afternoon light, which was extraordinary, a rose gold that turned the white world pink and warm. She showed him where the east wall of the permanent house should stand, walking through the snow and pointing, her breath rising in white clouds. He walked beside her and asked questions about the orientation and the drainage, and listened to her answers with complete attention because they were good answers, carefully considered, practical and visionary at the same time. Here, she said, stopping on a flat section that was elevated just enough above the creek plain to be safe from spring flooding. This is where the front door faces. South-southeast, full afternoon light. He stood beside her and looked at the view she was describing. The land fell away gently toward the creek, and beyond it the far ridge caught the last of the rose-gold light and turned amber. It was one of the finest views he had ever seen. Yes, he said. Here. She turned to look at him. Her cheeks were pink from the cold and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was, in that particular light, the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at. He kissed her right there in the snow in the rose-gold light, with the creek running cold and clear to their left and the land stretching out around them in every direction, and she kissed him back with her arms around his neck and her face tilted up. When they broke apart, she was laughing a little, breathless with cold and something else. You kissed me in the snow, she said. I did, he said. Very well, she said, entirely pleased about it. And that was a good enough description of that moment that he carried it with him for the rest of his life. November moved on. The snow settled and hardened and became the landscape rather than a disruption of it. They established a rhythm, the rhythm of two people who are building something together and have decided, without needing to announce it formally, that the building is a shared project. She surveyed and recorded and planned. He built and repaired and went on long rides to check the boundaries of the land and to ride occasionally to Redemption Creek for supplies. On one of these supply rides, in the second week of November, he stopped at Charles Vance's office and inquired about the status of the land filing. Vance looked at him with his careful eyes. The acknowledgment came from Cheyenne last week, he said. The claim is formally registered in Miss Bailey's name. Any legal challenge from Prout would require him to demonstrate a prior valid claim, which he cannot do because he does not have one. Daniel felt something release in his shoulders that he had been holding since September. Is there any indication that Prout intends to pursue it legally? Vance made a small sound. Prout has no legal basis. I suspect he knows that. Whatever he intends to do, it will not be through the courts. He looked at Daniel over his spectacles. Are you staying on the land with Miss Bailey? Yes, Daniel said without hesitation. Vance nodded slowly. Good, he said. She is a remarkable young woman. Her father was a man of integrity. I would like to see his daughter's claim secure. Daniel rode back to the northeastern parcel with the news, and when he told Clara, she sat very still for a moment and then closed her eyes, and when she opened them they were bright. It is done, she said. It is done, he said. Legally and finally done. Prout can posture all he likes. He cannot take this land from you. She looked at him. From us, she said very quietly. He looked back at her. From us, he agreed. Prout himself came in the third week of November. He came not with hired men but alone, which Daniel had not expected, and which told him something about the man that made him more rather than less watchful. Wade Prout was a man of about 55, broad across the chest, with the well-maintained look of someone who had done well in the world and intended to stay that way. He rode a very fine horse and wore a coat that had been expensive when it was made. He approached the shelter at midday when the sun was at its highest and the light left nowhere to hide. Daniel was outside when he came, working on an extension to the woodpile shelter. He set down his tools and waited. Prout reined in and looked at the log shelter and the cleared ground and the carefully staked boundaries of the planned permanent house, and something moved across his face that might have been respect and might have been calculation. "You have done a good deal of work here," he said. "Yes," Daniel said. "You are the man she hired to guard her." "I am the man who is staying on this land," Daniel said. "The distinction matters." Prout looked at him. His eyes were not pale like the rider who had come before. They were dark and intelligent, and they assessed things quickly. "I want to speak to Miss Bailey," he said. "Then speak respectfully," Daniel said. Prout looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, which was not submission but was acknowledgement, and that too told Daniel something. Clara came out of the shelter, having heard the horses. She stood in the doorway and looked at Prout without surprise and without fear. "Mr. Prout," she said. "Miss Bailey." He took off his hat, which Clara received with the faint, careful expression of someone noting an unexpected courtesy. "I would like to speak plainly with you." "I prefer plain speaking," she said. He looked at her. "I am not a man who gives up on what he wants," he said. "Your father knew that. He held out for 3 years, and I respected him for it even when it frustrated me. I believe in being direct, so I will tell you that I have looked into the legal status of your claim, and I understand that it is now formally registered and that any challenge I might mount would be an exercise in money and time with no realistic prospect of success." Clara said nothing. "I am here to tell you that you have won," Prout said. "Fair and square through legal process. The land is yours." "I am not going to send any more men out here." Clara studied him. "And your reason for coming to tell me this personally?" Prout looked at the ground for a moment. "Your father and I disagreed about this land," he said. "But I knew Gareth Bailey for 15 years and I did not disrespect him. I had my men in Redemption Creek when you were there, and I will not tell you that was innocent, but it was never meant to be more than pressure." He paused. "It was not well judged." Clara was quiet for a long time. Daniel watched her face. "It was not well judged," she said finally. "No." She held his gaze. "I am not my father. I do not make friends easily with men who have sent people to threaten me, but I am also not interested in enemies when enemies are not necessary." She paused. "The land is mine. The claim is registered. I will build here and I will stay here. If that is understood, then I have no need to pursue grievances." Prout nodded once. "It is understood." He rode away and they watched him go, and Clara stood very still until he had gone over the eastern ridge and out of sight. "Do you believe him?" Daniel asked. "I believe that he is a pragmatic man," she said, "and that he has assessed his position and found it untenable. Yes, I believe him." She paused. "I also know that does not mean he is a good man. Only that the particular battle is finished." "That is enough," Daniel said. "For now," she agreed. "Yes, that is enough." That evening they sat by the fire, and she showed him the plans she had been drawing for the permanent house. They were detailed and careful and genuinely beautiful in the way that a plan is beautiful when the person who made it is both technically precise and imaginatively alive. He looked at the plans for a long time and then he said, "Show me what you are imagining for the study." She showed him. The study was against the south wall, with a wide window facing the land and a deep window seat that she had drawn in, with built-in shelves along 2 walls. "And here," she said, pointing to a space at the back of the house, "this is the room I have been thinking about most." It was larger than the study, with 2 east-facing windows and a fireplace. She had drawn it simply, without many details. She looked at him as he looked at it. "What room is this?" he asked. "I do not know yet exactly," she said, "but I thought it should be large for whatever comes." He looked at her. "Clara," he said, "yes, I want to ask you something." She set down the plans and looked at him fully. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who said exactly what he meant when he had worked out what it was. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because the land needs a legal partner, or because the winter is hard, or because any practical reason that could be offered. Because I have loved you since approximately the second hour I spent in your company, and because I want to spend every other hour of my life in your company, And because when I imagine the study and the kitchen and the porch and the room at the back of the house, I do not imagine them without you in them, and I also do not imagine them without myself in them beside you." He paused. "That is the truth of it." She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very bright. "Daniel Boone," she said. "Yes." "You have been asking me that question for 3 weeks," she said, "in various nonverbal ways. I have been saying yes for approximately the same length of time." She reached out and took his hand. "Yes," she said, plainly and directly and without qualification. "Yes." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, and she leaned forward and kissed him, and the fire was warm and the snow was falling again outside, quietly and thoroughly, covering the land. They were married in Redemption Creek in the first week of December 1878, in the small wooden church at the north end of town, by the minister who served 3 congregations, and who looked at them both with the experienced eyes of a man who could read the quality of a union. It was a quiet ceremony, witnessed by Charles Vance and the hotel clerk with the spectacles whose name was Henry, and by a Shoshone woman named Bird Who Counts, who lived near the northeastern parcel and who had become in the previous weeks something approaching a neighbor and something approaching a friend, having come to their camp one afternoon with dried venison and an assessment of their building plans that was both generous and incisive. Bird Who Counts sat in the front pew of the little church and watched with dark eyes that were both serious and warm, and when the minister pronounced them married, she made a small sound of approval that was entirely sincere. After the ceremony, Charles Vance bought them dinner at the hotel dining room, and Henry the clerk produced, from somewhere behind the desk, a small bottle of rye whiskey that they drank from china cups in the lobby because it was more dignified. Clara sat beside Daniel at the table, and he kept his hand on hers the entire time, and she did not move it away. They talked and laughed, and Vance told stories about the early days of his practice in the territory, and Bird Who Counts told them about the winter 3 years before when the snow had come so deep that her family had not been able to reach the creek for a month and had melted snow in pots for water, and described this as an interesting logistical challenge rather than a hardship, which was a way of looking at the world that Daniel found himself admiring deeply. They rode back to the northeastern parcel as the afternoon faded, the two of them on their horses with the cold, clean air around them, and the white land stretching out in every direction. Clara rode beside him, her cheeks pink, her hair properly pinned under her hat, and they rode in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that is so comfortable it requires no filling. At the edge of the land she reined in her horse and looked out over it. "This is ours," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. "I did not know when my father left me this land that he was giving me this," she said. "I thought he was giving me the land. But I think he knew I would have to fight for it, and I think he knew that the fighting would bring me to something I needed." Daniel looked at her. "You brought yourself," he said. "Everything that happened, you brought yourself to it." She shook her head. "I could not have held on without you." "You would have held on," he said. "You would have held on. I simply got to be here while you did it." She looked at him for a long time with those green eyes. Then she turned her horse toward the shelter, and he rode beside her. Winter deepened around the land in the weeks that followed, the cold becoming the kind of permanent cold that is not a weather event but a simple fact of the world. And they lived in the log shelter with its warm fireplace and its single window facing east, and they worked on the plans for the permanent house with increasing specificity, because the plans were how they spent the winter evenings, refining and discussing and occasionally disagreeing, which they were both direct enough to do and good-tempered enough to resolve. Bird Who Counts came by twice a week, and they shared meals, and she taught Clara techniques for preserving food that were more efficient than what Clara already knew, and taught Daniel how to read the particular signs of the land in winter that indicated where the spring melt would run and where it would pool, information that would matter enormously to the placement of the vegetable garden. Daniel in turn helped Bird Who Counts with a persistent problem in her own shelter, a roof section that was not holding the cold out properly, and spent 2 days fixing it while Clara sketched revised drainage plans. It was in January that Clara told him. She told him in the evening, with the fire lit and the wind doing its loud work outside, quite simply and directly as she told him everything. "I am expecting a baby," she said. He looked at her. "Early September," she said, "or possibly late August. I am not entirely certain yet." He was very still for a moment, not from shock but from the particular quality of receiving a piece of information that rearranges the entire landscape of everything, and requires a moment to absorb completely. Then he was on his feet, and she was in his arms, and he held her very carefully, as though something had changed structurally, and she laughed a little at the carefulness. "I am not made of glass," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I know you are not." He held her more normally but did not let go. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise well." He leaned back to look at her face. "We need to accelerate the house," he said. "The permanent house. It needs to be ready before August." She smiled. "I calculated the same thing," she said. He looked at her, and something in him was so full that it had nowhere to go except into the expression on his face, open and unguarded in a way he had spent a long time not being. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." He kissed her forehead and then her temple, and then pulled her back against him, and they sat in the firelight for a long time, making no plans and asking no questions, just being in the fact of it. In February, they began building in earnest. The winter was not done, but the hard cold had peaked, and there were days when the sun was strong enough to make the snow on the south-facing slopes run in thin rivulets, and Daniel used those days to begin laying the foundation of the permanent house. He hauled stone from the creek bed, and from the ridge larger stones for the foundation walls, flat stones for the floor of the main room. He mixed mortar in the cold and wrapped the fresh work in burlap at night to keep it from freezing before it could set. Clara, who had adjusted her field work to accommodate her condition with characteristic pragmatism, supervised the foundation layout with her instruments and her careful eye for level and true. Bird Who Counts came and worked beside them on the days she was free, and she turned out to be an excellent builder in her own right, with opinions about door placement and interior flow that were consistently correct. "The door should face this way," she said one afternoon, gesturing with her measuring stick, "so that when you open it in the morning you see the mountain. Every morning you see the mountain. This is important." Clara looked at where she was pointing and then at Daniel. "She is right," Clara said. "She is right," Daniel agreed. The door faced the mountain. By late March the foundation was complete and they had begun the walls. Spring came in stages, tentatively at first and then with conviction, the snow retreating up the ridges and the creek running high and loud with melt water. The grass came back green and extravagant, and the cottonwoods along the creek lit up in yellow-green that was so vivid it looked painted. Daniel worked on the walls every day, and Clara worked beside him when she could. And Bird Who Counts came often, and sometimes Henry from the hotel came on his day off, because he had decided he wanted to learn something about building, and because Redemption Creek bored him when the weather was good. The house grew through April and May, taking on its shape. The large main room with its fireplace, the kitchen on the north side with the good iron range that they had ordered from Cheyenne, and that arrived by freight wagon in the first week of May, to Clara's undisguised delight. The study with its south-facing window and the deep window seat exactly as she had planned it, and the large back room with 2 east-facing windows and its own fireplace. By the time the wildflowers came in on the June mountain slopes, the house was structurally complete. The roof was solid. The windows were fitted with glass that had come from the same freight order as the stove. The stone floors of the main room and kitchen were level and smooth, the work Daniel was most silently proud of. The walls were whitewashed inside, which Clara had done herself in late May, moving slowly and deliberately and singing to herself while she did it, the same slow melody in a minor key that he had heard her sing once beside the half-built first shelter, the song her father had sung. He heard it from outside and stopped working to listen. He stood in the June sun in front of his own house, the house he had built on land that was theirs, listening to his wife sing her father's song inside the walls, and felt the weight he had carried for years, the weight Clara had said he could outweigh by what he chose to be, shift and settle into something that was still there, but was no longer the largest thing. He went inside and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and she turned and saw him. She had a paintbrush in one hand and a streak of whitewash across her forearm, and the front of her apron was impossibly domestic, and she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his life. "You stopped working," she said. "I was listening," he said. She looked at him. Then she smiled, that full, real smile that went all the way to her eyes, and reached out her non-paintbrush hand to him. He crossed the kitchen and took it. They stood in the white-walled kitchen of their finished house and looked at each other. "We built it," she said. "Yes," he said. "My father would have liked it," she said. "I think he would have liked it very much," Daniel said. "I think he would have liked the window seat particularly," she laughed. "He would have. He loved to sit in sunny spots." She looked around the kitchen. "And the stove. He would have been delighted about the stove." "He would have been delighted about a great deal," Daniel said quietly. She looked at him and understood what he meant and pressed his hand once firmly. "Yes," she said. "He would." Their son was born on the 23rd of August, 1879, in the new house, in the large back room with its east-facing windows in the early morning light. Bird Who Counts was there, as the most experienced and level-headed person they knew, and she managed the whole affair with calm efficiency and occasional encouraging words in her own language that Clara could not translate but found deeply comforting anyway. Daniel was, for approximately the first time in his adult life, genuinely frightened. He sat outside the closed door of the room for most of the night and the early morning, and did not move except to build up the fire and fetch water when Bird Who Counts asked for it, and he held himself very still and focused on breathing evenly, which was harder than guarding a hotel room had ever been. When Bird Who Counts opened the door and looked at him and said, "Come now," he went in. Clara was in the bed, tired in a way that was entirely different from any tired he had seen on her before, fundamental and complete, but her eyes were clear when she looked at him. In her arms was a small, red-faced person who was making very emphatic statements about his opinions of the world. "Come and meet your son," Clara said. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and felt something happen in his chest that had no name in any language he knew. "He is very loud," he said finally. "He has strong opinions," Clara agreed. "He takes after his mother." Daniel looked at her. "His mother has excellent opinions." She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her carefully and looked at the loud, definite, red-faced small person in her arms. "What shall we call him?" he asked. She had been thinking about it. He could tell by the slight pause, the pause of a woman who had already worked through the question and had arrived at an answer she was ready for. "Gareth," she said, "for my father, if you agree." "Gareth Daniel Boone," he said, trying it. She looked up at him. "Gareth Daniel Boone," she confirmed. He looked at their son, who had quieted slightly and was regarding the world with the slightly suspicious expression of someone who is reserving judgment. "Hello, Gareth," Daniel said. Gareth made a sound that was possibly agreement. Bird Who Counts appeared in the doorway with tea and looked at the three of them with dark, warm eyes and said, "Good. This is good," with the simple directness of a person stating an obvious truth. It was. The autumn of 1879 was the most productive and the most peaceful time of Daniel Boone's life, and he was aware of both qualities with a gratitude that was not taken lightly. He worked the land with a consistent hand, clearing the section Clara had identified for the kitchen garden, building a proper barn for the horses that was solid and well ventilated, fencing the lower pasture section in the way that would allow them to keep a few cattle the following spring. Clara worked on her surveying projects, taking contracts from neighboring landowners who needed accurate maps of their holdings, riding out in the mornings with Gareth in a carrier that Bird Who Counts had made, and that Clara had initially been skeptical of, and then had become dependent on, because it left her hands free for her instruments. She was developing a reputation in the territory as a thorough and reliable surveyor, which she accepted with the same matter-of-fact quality with which she accepted everything else, as something that was simply the result of doing the work well. In October, exactly 1 year after they had first ridden out to the northeastern parcel together, Clara came in from the south pasture where she had been checking the fence line and found Daniel in the study, working at the table where he had taken to doing the land record-keeping that the property required. Gareth was asleep in the basket beside the desk. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "What?" he said, without looking up. "I was thinking about a year ago," she said. He set down his pen and looked at her. "Which part of it?" She came in and sat in the window seat, the one he had built with the wide sill and the cushion she had made from wool and burlap. She looked out the south-facing window at the land. "All of it," she said. "All of it. The hotel room and the night on the creek and the law office and riding out here the first morning." She paused. "You were hired for one night." "Yes," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "And here you are when the snow is coming again." He looked out the window. The sky above the ridge to the north had the pewter quality he had learned to read. She was right. The first snow of the new season would come within days. "Here I am," he said. She turned to face him fully. "I would like to know," she said, in the tone she used when she was being very precise and wanted him to know she was being very precise, "that you do not regret it, any of it. Not staying, not building, not this life. I would like you to tell me truthfully." He looked at her for a long moment. At the woman he had met in a hotel room in September with her revolver on the table and her surveying journal open and her hair half out of its pins, who had carried her father's land claim through a Wyoming night in her arms, who had sung her father's song in their whitewashed kitchen, who had looked at him in the snow in the rose-gold light and been glad he kissed her, who had brought their son into the world in the east-facing room with its view of the mountain, who was sitting in the window seat he had built for her and looking at him with those green eyes that were always, always clear and always, always honest. "Clara," he said. "Yes. I was good at being alone," he said. "I want you to understand that. I was competent and self-sufficient and I had managed my life satisfactorily for a long time. I had a system." "I know," she said. "And every piece of that system now seems to me like the scaffolding you put up when you are planning to build the actual thing," he said. "Necessary at the time, meant to be taken down." He held her gaze. "I do not regret one day of this life. I regret only that I did not know its shape sooner." She was quiet for a moment. Then she got up from the window seat and crossed to where he was sitting and stood in front of him and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him very carefully, the way she looked at the land when she was mapping it, with full attention and no performance. "Good," she said. Then she kissed him with her hands still holding his face, and he pulled her down onto his lap and kissed her back, and Gareth made a small sound in his basket and then settled again. Outside, the first flakes of the season's first snow were beginning to fall. The years that followed were years of building, in the most fundamental sense of the word. The homestead on the northeastern parcel became, by the time Gareth was 2 years old, a property of genuine substance. The house with its warm kitchen and its study full of survey journals and its porch facing south where the afternoons were long and golden, the barn with its 4 horses and eventually 6 cattle, the kitchen garden that Clara had planned and Daniel had built and both of them had planted, which produced extravagantly, and which Bird Who Counts declared annually to be one of the more impressive gardens in the territory. Their second child came in the spring of 1882, a girl they named Iris Josephine Boone, for no particular person, but because Clara had seen the wild irises blooming along the creek on the morning she was born, and because Josephine was Daniel's grandmother's name, the trader's daughter who had built her life in the space between two worlds. Iris was, from her first weeks, entirely different from Gareth. Where Gareth had strong opinions and expressed them loudly, Iris was watchful and quiet, and absorbed everything with a pair of brown eyes that looked very much like Daniel's, and an expression of concentrated attention that was entirely her mother's. By the time Iris was 3 months old, Gareth had decided that she was interesting and had taken to sitting beside her wherever she was placed with the proprietary seriousness of an elder sibling who has decided to take the job seriously. The three of them, and then the four of them, and eventually all of them together, made the house a full and warm and genuinely alive place. Not perfect, no house with children and cattle, and a dog named Commissioner that Gareth had named with great ceremony was perfect, but real and solid, and built on ground that was truly theirs. Clara continued her surveying work and developed over the following years a regional reputation that eventually brought her correspondence from as far away as Denver, from mining companies and land developers who needed accurate territorial maps, and had been told that Clara Bailey Boone was the person to produce them. She took the work she found interesting and declined the work she found ethically questionable, and she did this without apology, which was entirely characteristic. Daniel managed the land and took on occasional escort and security work when it was offered, and the terms were right, work he could do in reasonable proximity to home, and that did not require him to be gone for more than a week at a time. He had not entirely given up the skills that had defined his working life before Clara, but he had redirected them toward purposes that were entirely his own choice. He served for 2 years on the Redemption Creek Town Council, which he found tedious but necessary, and resigned when the council began considering ordinances that he considered unjust to the Shoshone communities whose land use was affected by the town's expansion, and filed a formal written objection that Charles Vance helped him compose, and that was placed in the official record. Bird, who counts, when she heard about this, came to the house and brought a pot of venison stew and sat at the kitchen table and said, "Good man," with great simplicity, which Daniel considered one of the finest things anyone had ever said to him. Gareth Bailey Boone grew into a boy who was methodical and curious, who followed his mother into the field with his own small notebook from the time he was 4 years old, and who asked questions about the land with a precision that Clara found both exhausting and deeply gratifying. He had Daniel's dark eyes and Clara's way of standing very still when he was thinking hard about something, and by the time he was 8, he could identify every major geological feature visible from the house and explain what each one told him about the history of the land. Iris grew into a girl who was artistic and mechanical simultaneously, who drew extraordinary pictures and could also fix the latch on the barn door with a piece of wire, and a degree of ingenuity that made Daniel laugh every time he thought about it. She had Clara's green eyes and Daniel's tendency to approach a problem from an unexpected angle, and she and Bird, who counts, had a particular friendship that was based on a shared appreciation for sitting quietly in good places and observing things. In 1884, when Gareth was 5 and Iris was 2, there was a third child, a boy they named Samuel, who came into the world with an ease that was almost alarming after the hard work of his predecessors, and who from his very first weeks had a quality of simple contentment that was new in the family. He lay in his basket and watched the world with evident approval, and grew into a boy who was sunny-natured and sociable, and who befriended every person and animal he encountered with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never seriously doubted that the world is well disposed toward him. The house expanded. Daniel added a second story in the summer of 1886, 2 bedrooms and a room that was used as a combination study and schoolroom, because the territorial school in Redemption Creek was a 2-hour ride in each direction, and Clara had decided to teach the children herself, which she did with her customary combination of rigor and genuine delight in the subjects. She taught mathematics and surveying and natural science and history and literature, the latter from a collection of books that had grown over the years into a proper library. The shelves Daniel had built her spilling over into the main room. She also taught them about injustice. She taught it plainly and specifically, with the same commitment to precision her father had given her. She taught them about the displacement of the Shoshone and the Arapaho from their lands, about the federal policies that had removed indigenous peoples from territory their families had lived on for centuries, about what it meant that their neighbor and friend Bird Who Counts had watched her family's traditional lands be claimed and allocated and fenced. She taught them this without simplifying it or softening it, because she believed, as her father had believed and as Daniel believed, that looking clearly at what is actually there, even when what is there is painful, is the beginning of being a person who can do something about it. Gareth asked hard questions. Iris drew pictures of the land in its different historical layers. Samuel listened carefully and then went and sat with Bird Who Counts for long hours. And what they talked about during those hours, he did not always report back. But Bird Who Counts looked at him, when she looked at Samuel, with the particular warmth of a person who is being heard properly. One October evening in 1887, when Clara was at her desk in the study working on a contract survey for a land company in northern Wyoming, and Daniel was sitting in the main room with the children around the fire, Gareth doing his mathematics and Iris drawing, and Samuel lying on his stomach with his chin on his hands looking at the fire with his particular expression of contented contemplation, Daniel looked at the scene in front of him and thought, with a clarity that required no effort at all, "This is the place I was building toward." He did not say it out loud because it did not require saying. It was simply true. Clara came in from the study and sat beside him on the bench in front of the fire and leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her without looking away from the children. She looked at the same scene he was looking at. "Gareth is going to be a surveyor," she said very quietly. "Yes," he said. "Iris is going to be something we do not have a name for yet," she said. "Also yes," he said. "And Samuel is going to be kind," she said. "Simply and comprehensively kind. Which is possibly the rarest thing." He looked at her. She was 41 and had spent 13 years on this land, and in the lines of her face was the whole story of those years. The sun and the cold and the work, and the laughing and the loss she had started with, and the building she had done since. And she was as beautiful to him as she had been in the doorway of a hotel room in Redemption Creek in September of 1878, and more beautiful than that, by the very exact amount that you know and love a person more after 13 years than you can in one evening. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those green eyes. "For what?" she asked. "For letting me stay," he said. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh, soft and warm. "You let yourself stay," she said. "You made that choice entirely on your own." "You made it possible," he said. She held his gaze. "We made it possible," she said. He kissed her temple and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat with their children in the firelight in the house they had built on the land she had fought for. And outside the October night was coming down cold and clear over the Wyoming territory, over the creek running fast and cold at the western edge of the land, and the long ridges to the east and north, and the mountain that you could see from the front door every morning. And in the morning, when the first snow of the season came down soft and quiet and turned the land white, Daniel Boone stood in the doorway of his house and watched it come, with Clara standing beside him and their 3 children looking past them from inside at the white world, with expressions ranging from Gareth's analytical interest to Iris's artistic excitement to Samuel's simple joy. And he thought about a man who had ridden into a town in September with $40 and a reputation, and no plans to stay past sunrise. He thought about a hotel room, and a woman with a revolver on the table and her father's surveying journals in her arms. He thought about a night on a creek bank under the stars, and the way she had talked about building the place you want rather than finding it already made. He thought about rose-gold snow light and a kitchen being whitewashed and a small red-faced person with strong opinions and a particular pair of green eyes that had been, from the second hour he had known them, the clearest and most honest eyes he had ever looked into. He had been hired for one night. He was still here when the snow came. He would be here for every snow that followed, every summer that opened the land, every spring that ran the creek high, every autumn that turned the aspens gold and cold and brief and blazing. He would be here for all of it beside her, building the thing they had built, tending what they had made. Clara felt him looking and turned her face up to him, and he looked back at her in the snowlight, which was not rose gold today but the flat white of a November morning, and which was its own kind of beautiful, and she smiled at him, not the small careful first smile of a woman assessing a stranger but the full unhurried smile of a woman who knows exactly where she is and has chosen to be here, and he smiled back. "Snow," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come inside," she said. "The coffee is ready, and Gareth has something he wants to show you about the eastern boundary measurements." He stepped back inside. She closed the door behind them both. The snow fell on the land, on the house, on the kitchen garden and the barn and the creek and the ridges and the mountain to the north, quietly and thoroughly, covering everything. And inside the house that Daniel Boone had built with his own hands on ground that Clara Bailey had fought for and won, there was warmth and firelight, and the sound of children, and the smell of coffee, and a woman's voice explaining something about measurement to an attentive small boy. And all of it was real and solid and built to last. And it did.